What's up, guys? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran.com, and I'm here with Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst out of Moscow. And today we're going to be talking about the shocking assassination of Aleksandr Zakharchenko. So, Mark, let's dive into the assassination of Zakharchenko. Give us a background. Who is Aleksandr Zakharchenko?
Yeah. Alex, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the Duran. I do this video today with a little bit of a heavy heart. I feel quite personally and am quite upset about this situation with this assassination that was quite literally a terrorist act in the Donbass. And full disclosure for this video, I am personally connected, so take what I say with that under consideration. My wife is Crimean. We have family in Simferopol, and we have family members across East Ukraine, including in Donbass, Kharkov, and Odessa. So you can filter that into your consideration of what I have to say about the situation. Aleksandr Vladimirovich Zakharchenko, he was just assassinated on Friday, which is the last day of August in 2018. He started life as a local boy. He's from Donetsk. He was studied in university and became an engineer. He served as a engineer and an electrician in the coal mines, and that is the work of Donetsk. The whole Donbass region is coal mines and steel mills. It is an industrial area. Up until the conflict, which started in 2014, it was the biggest economic area of activity for exports of the Ukraine, be it coal, steel, chemicals, etc. When the putsch occurred in Ukraine in the beginning of 2014, it was an openly West-backed putsch with a whole series of American and EU officials descending into Kiev, openly supporting crowds that had gathered with the express purpose of overthrowing the Ukrainian government. In the end, because the president Yanukovych refused to sign the EU association agreement. He had actually pushed for it himself and campaigned on it. But when he got the final extremely long text in his hand, it was quite clear it was a neoliberal shock therapy diktat with no recourse and without any funds to help ameliorate the conditions, which would have included firing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of state employees. Which would have destroyed the economy. And everything within that agreement involved leveling the economy to the ground and building it up from nothing, according to EU, to fit better with the EU. And it would have been terrible economically and certainly politically. So he backed out of it. And that is when the EU and the US openly backed, instigated, and helped overthrow that democratically, however flawed, democratically elected government. After the Kiev was seized, the president fled, and these Banderite battalions seized control of government buildings in Kiev and began to try to extend their rule to the rest of Ukraine. In particular, East Ukraine did not accept this, and they started to mobilize and organize to resist the initial putsch forces which tried to extend their rule over the Donbass. The Donbass is in East Ukraine on the Russian border. And it has to be said that Russia was involved there, just like for the Maidan. They received advisors, they received trainers, and certainly they received financial and humanitarian aid, and most likely weapons as well, just like weapons have been supplied to the West-backed putsch regime in Kiev. Zakharchenko became prime minister. He was served in the armed forces of Donbass. Now, it has to be said that the armed forces of Donbass are mostly the people of Donbass and all over the rest of Ukraine. There were tens of thousands of defectors from all of the military services and the police units of Ukraine who either went to Crimea, Donbass, or Russia because they didn't like what was happening in their country.
Why Donbass? Why Crimea? Why this area defected? And can you also just say a little bit for our viewers as to the government that was overthrown? There is that narrative in the West that they pushed that it was a pro-Putin government, and he was a Putin puppet.
This is ridiculous. This sets the standard by calling him pro-Russia or pro-Putin as anyone who is not rabidly anti-Russian and fanatically pro-Western, pro-NATO, then becomes pro-Russian. Putin and Yanukovych actually didn't get along very well. There were plenty of discussion in Russia that actually Putin got along better with the Orange Revolution predecessor, the gas princess Yulia Tymoshenko. Yanukovych was himself campaigning and pushing for the EU association agreement, which Russia certainly didn't agree with. He only backed down at the last minute when he saw the economic repercussions of the final deal that was given to him, the lack of funds to help make the transition, and realized the economic damage to the country and, of course, the political damage to his own government as a result of the shock, of the economic shock that this would cause in the country. Right. So he backed out. But he certainly wasn't a pro-Putin leader. Why would a pro-Putin leader be campaigning to join an EU association agreement? Exactly. It's absurd. He only turned to Russia in the end when he had such an awful deal from the EU, and he was trying to do something to help stabilize his country's economy. He was corrupt. Every leader of the Ukraine has been corrupt. The current leadership of Ukraine is corrupt, if anything, more corrupt than Yanukovych was. Corruption is something they've had to live with, since they first gained independence in the 1990s. The EU, an internal EU report has assessed that every government in the EU is breathtakingly corrupt. But that is not a reason for foreign governments to come in and back the overthrow of EU governments. It's absurd. He was a democratically elected president. The EU and the US recognized Yanukovych's election as the freest and fairest election that Ukraine ever had, and they were perfectly willing to do business with him up until he said no to the EU's diktat that would basically make Ukraine a colony of the EU, and he only said no to that again in the very end when he saw the final version on his table, and then there was made clear that there would be no funds to help make that transition. Right. So calling him pro-Russian is utter bunk, and that sets the bar of being pro-Russian as anyone who is not rabidly anti-Russian. Right.
So why Donetsk? Why Crimea? Why these regions?
Yeah, these regions of Russia. Ukraine is a ethnically diverse country, right? You have those who are considered full ethnic Ukrainians. You have some Hungarians in the West. You have Romani. You have Crimean Tatars, which is a minority in the Crimea, a small minority. And you also have a lot of Russians, ethnic Russians. And the highest concentration of ethnic Russians is in Donbass and in the Crimea. In the Crimea, they reach nearly 80% of the population. In the Donbass, it's about it's somewhat less than that. But you also have the phenomenon that a lot of the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, again, the Donbass is the greatest concentration across East Ukraine, they have a different sense of Ukrainian identity. There is a divided Ukrainian identity. In West Ukraine, the principal component of Ukrainian identity is anti-Russianness. They hate Russia. They hated the Soviet Union. They weren't even part of Ukraine until World War II. They were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Austro-Hungarian Empire before, leading up to World War I. And it was only in those final years, around World War II that they were brought into not only the Soviet Union but Ukraine. We call that area of West Ukraine historically Galicia, and they really weren't considered Ukrainians. In East Ukraine, the Ukrainian national identity is pro-Russian. They see Russia as a brother people, and even the people that aren't ethnic Russian. And you have to remember that as a result of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, there is so much intermarriage, not only among Russians and Ukrainians, and in particular in East Ukraine, but of peoples all over the former Soviet Union, that it's sometimes often really hard to say what is Russian and what is Ukrainian. But in general, the people of East Ukraine did have very pro-Russian, at least Russian cultural views. They speak Russian. The majority of the people of Ukraine speak Russian in their daily business, in academia, and so on. So they have a pro-Russian sense of Ukrainian identity. They didn't want to be part of a new Ukraine that was anti-Russian and aligning itself so vociferously with the West. So this is why you saw this uprising in Donbass. And it has to be said, it's not only ethnic Russians. There's what they call in Ukraine around Slovak Ukrainians, East Ukrainians. East Ukrainians who remember the Soviet Union and the relationship between Russia and Ukraine fondly, and often have more left communist Soviet nostalgia. And in some cases, this is even stronger than it is in Russia, particularly say Moscow, because Ukraine essentially never came out of the 90s. They never had a Putin, and their country has always had to deal with essentially the rule behind the throne of oligarchs, of business oligarchs that have exploited the people across Ukraine. And so in East Ukraine, you have this combination of ethnic Russians and Slovak Ukrainians who feel very strongly towards Russia and remember the Soviet Union with nostalgia and fondness. Right. And so that led, to there was large-scale protests across the Donbass. When the Maidan seized power in Kiev, they were held in multiple cities. They're practically forgotten now. There were referendums held. They were ignored by the West. Militias started to form. They were attacked by, the initial Ukrainian battalions off the Maidan that would later become Azov and Aidar and these other Banderite fascist, neo-fascist violent groups. Because initially Ukraine did not, the new government in Ukraine, the Maidan regime, did not have control of the military. Because so many of the military actually defected to Donbass or Crimea or Russia in total, and those that were left were completely disorganized, and many of them didn't want to attack their own people. They if anything, they wanted this settled politically. The military had been trying to stay out of this whole thing. So initially, the Ukrainian military was very slow. It took a matter of months before the Putsch regime managed to actually purge enough people from the ranks and gain full control of the military to be able to use them in Donbass. So Zakharchenko, he became prime minister after serving in the militias, the nascent military forces of what, is called a self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. Now, it has to be said that these areas do not control all of the Donbass. They only control about 1/3 of the territory of the respective Donetsk and Lugansk regions of the Ukraine. The Donetsk, the self-proclaimed republic that Zakharchenko became the prime minister of, is a small state about the size of Delaware, with a population of around 2 million people. I said he started out life as an ordinary guy. He was an electrician and an engineer in a coal mine. He was genuinely very popular in Donetsk and in Donbass in general. He was one of these leaders who led from the front lines, right. And there was open conflict with Ukrainian battalions and then the armed forces. He led from the front lines and was wounded twice. He was kind of a man's man. He is now mourned by a wife and 4 children, 4 sons that he is leaving behind. He was a family man.
And so obviously he was a man of the people, and I think that takes us to his assassination, where it was at a cafe, from what I understand, in the center of town, or he was just going about his daily business at a cafe, and he was assassinated.
Yeah, he was assassinated. It was at a cafe, kind of ironically, that calls itself the Separatist. The word that the regime, the Westback regime in Kiev, refers to the people of East Ukraine. And he had survived over a dozen previous assassination attempts.
And so take us now to your thoughts, Mark. I mean, obviously, these are your thoughts, and you knowing the region well and knowing the history. Who do you think, in your best estimation, was behind this assassination or attempt? Or what do you think will reveal in the future as they do an investigation as to who orchestrated this attempt? I mean, we've heard, obviously, there's the government in Kiev, there's the neo-Nazi element, but we've also heard the government in Kiev claim that there was a lot of infighting within the Donbass as to who was going to take power and who was going to rule. So give us your assessment here.
Yeah. First of all, there have been at least nine previous assassinations of major figures and political leaders in Donbass in the past 2 to 3 years. Givy, Motorola, Mozgovoy, and several others. And Zakharchenko is only the latest and the most tragic because he was so competent generally as leader. And it's a big loss to the people of Donbass. None of the other previous assassinations have been firmly identified as to who killed them, and that does not give me hope for any firm, unquestionable determination. Of course, the Westback regime in Kiev blames either infighting in Donbass among the leaders there, or that the Russian security services assassinated himself, which is ridiculous because he, was largely aligned with Russia and was fairly competent at what he was doing, and provided stability, which is what Russia wants to see in Donbass and Ukraine more than anything. The Russian side, the Russian foreign ministry at least, has openly blamed the Westback Putsch regime for his assassination. At least 2 people have supposedly been apprehended out of Donetsk, the Donetsk authorities. They say that it was Ukrainian saboteurs, and there's the question of a missing bodyguard who may have been involved in this, but these are all speculative details at this point. My immediate reaction, and I think the immediate reaction of most people is that this was obvious, that this was the putsch authorities in Kiev, either the security services, the SBU, or someone acting on their behalf, their pay. Numerous Ukrainian leaders have openly called for Zakharchenko's assassination before. It's no secret that they wanted him dead. It's no secret that openly in social media, many of the officials and the advisors to the authorities in Kiev are openly celebrating his death. They consider it a big thing. Now, it has to be said, this was a bombing in a car. It killed him and several other people, including a small child. This was not only assassination, it was a terrorist act. It was an act of political terror. And he will be replaced. Already the Deputy Prime Minister, Dmytro Trapezhenko, is stepping in, although there will likely be elections, probably within the next half year to determine who will follow him.
What does this mean then, Mark, having elections? What does this mean for Donetsk? What does this mean for Ukraine, for Russia? What's the U.S.'s involvement here, if any?
Yeah. Well, the official statement from Putin released an official statement that said that Aleksandr Zakharchenko was a true leader for his people, a brave and determined man, and a Donbass patriot. He protected his homeland during a difficult time, bore a great personal responsibility, and led his people. The contemptible murder of Aleksandr Zakharchenko is further evidence that those who have chosen a path of terror, violence, and fear do not want to search for a peaceful political situation to the conflict or have a real dialogue with the people in the southeast, but thrive on destabilization to bring the people of Donbass to their knees. This will not happen. I believe that the organizers and executors will be punished for what they did, and he offers his condolences to family and friends and the people of all the people of Donbass. The words out of Kiev were celebrating his death. So, what does this mean? Well, we have seen some statements from the foreign ministry that blame Ukraine, but at the same time, they call this an internal Ukrainian matter, where they're obviously drawing a degree of remove. There is going to be no overt or certainly not anything serious military action, neither from the Donbass or from the Russian government as a result of this. Myself, I suggested that, of course, obviously, at least in terms of quid pro quo, you might think that the fair response would be to assassinate the Westback putsch leader, the oligarch Poroshenko in Kiev, as a quid pro quo. But, of course, the difference is that Zakharchenko was genuinely popular among the people of Donbass, whereas Poroshenko is extremely unpopular with an approval rating below 10% most of the time, and he's incompetent. So removing him would unfortunately just be a gift, to the putsch regime there and the Americans who are pulling the puppet strings of that little client state they've made out of the rest of Ukraine there.
Will there be a reciprocal?
No, there will not
response?
Be a reciprocal. There will not be a military action. I don't know where the investigation will go, if we'll ever get a firm answer. This event will mostly just be painted over. It will, of course, harden the attitudes of the people in Donbass, as Zakharchenko was genuinely liked. This makes settlement of the conflict there via the Minsk agreement, with who it was Zakharchenko who signed. Again, Russia didn't sign it. Zakharchenko and the leader of Lugansk signed it. There's a question. Certainly, the Minsk agreement is dead. It's been dead for a long time, but this certainly is the very last nail in that coffin. And where does that leave this? It was clear that Ukraine could never settle this politically, because if they had to stand on a debate stage and debate the leaders of the Donbass about what happened during the putsch, what has happened in the country separately, could you see Poroshenko and Zakharchenko on the same stage discussing with each other, arguing with each other, that would have been the end of the Poroshenko, regime, the putsch regime right there, because it would have been this blunt, manly man's honesty against this corrupt, pro-Western oligarch. So they can never allow that to happen. The frozen conflict will continue. It will continue as a frozen conflict, unfortunately, for the near future. I do not expect any major military moves by Ukraine either, simply because they lack the military ability, the conviction, and most importantly, they lack the open backing of at least President Trump in the United States right now, who has no love for the regime there, as it quite obviously openly backed Clinton during the campaign. So while he can certainly count, the leaders there can count on the support of the U.S. deep state and the EU, they cannot count on the support of the U.S. So I do not expect to see major military action. Unfortunately, this will harden hearts on both sides. It will put another nail in any hope of any near-term political settlement of it. But I don't expect any major military reaction. And unfortunately, I have to say, I don't expect any kind of, repercussions, from the Donbass or Russia taking some type of action, which I think they should, in retribution for this assassination and terror attack. Frozen conflict it was. Frozen conflict it will remain.
It will remain.
Yeah. I have to say that Zakharchenko, he was the only decent leader that the Donbass politically has really had. It's a huge loss. He won every battle and lost the war. At least he's out of the war himself. This glory to Ukraine, this fascist Banderite slogan that has now been made the official military cheer of Ukraine by this, pro-fascist regime in Kiev, is glory to Ukraine. Real glory to heroes, glory to Ukraine, glory to the nation. It's an ultra-nationalist greeting that was used by the UPA, the OUN, the fascist collaborators in World War II with Nazi Germany. Real heroes don't need glory. Real heroes need peace. Rest in peace, Zakharchenko.
Rest in peace. 42 years old. 42 years old. And Mark, via Moscow, I'm not going to let you go just yet, because before I let you go, I have to ask you one final question real quick. Now that McCain, who was one of the biggest backers of the Ukraine and the coup, has passed away, he was involved with some very nasty folks. And you mentioned the word fascist, neo-Nazi Bandera. Very quickly, before I let you go, for our viewers, is the Ukraine government and is the Ukraine military and many of the battalions, are they really fascists, neo-Nazis?
Yeah, yes.
Your take.
Yeah. I mean, it's often said that as Russian propaganda, even as you've recently seen articles out of the Atlantic Council that said, yes, the Ukraine has a far-right problem, and in parentheses, no, RT didn't write this. Yes, the Ukrainian government is, its members are either Banderites, all right, Ukrainian fascists who worship Stefan Bandera, who was a fascist, ultra-nationalist West Ukrainian collaborator and leader during World War II. The speaker of the Ukrainian Rada, Andrei Parubi, is a neo-Nazi. He is it is the third highest position in the Ukrainian government. He had formerly been the leader of the Social Nationalist Party in Ukraine, which was recognized even by Western mainstream media as a fascist, a neo-fascist, a skinhead, however you like to call it, organization. We keep seeing streets and battalions named after these Nazi collaborators during World War II. You have an Institute of Historical Memory whose entire job is to whitewash history and the collaboration of West Ukraine with Nazi Germany during World War II. You see battalions, openly, neo-Nazi battalions. Again, check the Western mainstream media. You don't have to believe me. Azov, Idar, C-14. These are all paid by the Ukrainian regime, which is paid by the U.S. and EU taxpayers to exist. They are armed by them, they are trained by them, and they are let loose as brown shirts, as stormtroopers, to stomp the rest of the country into line. We've recently seen Roma gypsy camps be attacked by these government-sponsored, government-officiated militias of fascists, and Roma have been killed and driven. They're being ethnically cleansed out of the country. And there's no repercussions. No one is punished. Nothing is done. And who does this? Does a pro-Western liberal democratic government do these things? No, a fascist government does. This is Poroshenko himself a fascist? No, he is a corrupt oligarch, right? But many of the people in that government, whether we're talking Avakov, the Interior Ministry, Parubi, others within the Ukrainian Rada, within the Ukrainian security services now, within these battalions, they are fascist. And they keep these all pro-Western oligarchs like Poroshenko in power. So, and there is a genuine segment of people that are pro-Western liberals that accept all of this because it draws their country closer to the West, and they provide a veneer of democratic respectability. They are the ones who mouth the right words for the cameras, while the fascists are out beating stomping people to ground and killing them in East Ukraine.
Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst. Thank you very much. Aleksandr Zakharchenko, 42 years old. Rest in peace. Mark, any final words?
Rest in peace, Zakharchenko.
Rest in peace. Rest in peace. Mark Sleboda, via Moscow. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.